Oh, you're on a phone. Okay, there you go. Good.
There we go.
Fantastic. Okay, excellent.
So I'll read
Okay,
the intro. My name is Bryon Haynes. I'm a student here at St. Mary's University, and tonight I'm joined by Fred Seibert. And I'll let him introduce himself, but he has just been a pivotal part of all of our childhoods, and even some of our adulthoods now with Castlevania. Um, and it's just an amazing opportunity to be here with you tonight.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm Fred Seibert and I make cartoons.
Okay, getting into our first question. Um, what made you go into the entertainment industry, particularly animation, considering you started your career with radio and music production? How did you get started, and what has that path looked like to get you here tonight?
I come from a science family. Um, my parents are pharmacists or were pharmacists. My cousins are biochemists and neurosurgeons. And I was a science math kid. And that's what I expected to do in my life. I did take music lessons pretty much from the time I was 7 years old. And I loved playing music. I thought it was great. And then when I was 12 years old, the Beatles came to America. And without me knowing it, without me realizing it, my entire life changed. I started rock bands. Like in my day, everybody started rock bands like they had TikTok accounts. It was like it became so popular to do that. And I was just one of those people. I loved it, thought it was great. But I still decided I was going to go to college to study chemistry. And a few weeks into college, I looked at my lab mate and I said, I really like the Beatles better than this. And I walked out of school into the college radio station and I never left. I mean, to the point that I still haven't graduated from college because I spent all of my time in the radio station learning, I had a radio show. I was engineered other radio shows. I learned about music that I'd never heard of, that I had no interest in, that all of a sudden I became interested in. I started recording some of that music primarily in the jazz field. And, in my day, popular recording artists, they move the culture. If they did something, no matter how obscure and tiny it was front page news. Now if a music star wants to be on the front of the paper, they have to murder somebody almost literally, because music people are just part of the culture. They don't lead the culture anymore. But I was there during that time when the idea of making records was really, really special. And I loved doing it. Thought it was great. I started a little record company in college, released a few records, made blues and jazz records, even though I didn't know too much about blues and jazz, but I thought it was exciting. We went bankrupt. I took a job at a country music radio station that I had no interest in, but I needed the job. And one day, my boss, who was both brilliant and crazy, recommended me to another radio guy who had left the industry and is doing something that at the time we thought was very weird called cable TV. And he offered me a job in cable television. And I said, no, I'm not really interested. I watch television, I don't make it. I had made a couple of commercials at the country music radio station with like Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton, but that was it, 30 seconds. And I went and interviewed with the guy. I was young. I was 27. He was 25. He was the boss. And I realized that he was smarter than my bosses in radio. And one of the things my mentor taught me was that the job didn't really matter. That you should go with the smartest person you can find. And if you're with a smart person, good things will happen. So I quit my job in country music radio, went to work at a place called the Movie Channel, which still exists, but it's a small channel, part of Showtime. And 30 days after I got to my job, my boss put a memo on all of our desks saying that we were now going to start a music channel. And I marched right into his office and almost demanded that he hire me for this music channel. And he didn't really understand why I wanted to be hired. And I said, well, I know more about music than anybody on the floor, including you. He goes, oh, you're right. Okay. Like you can work at this new thing. And I said, okay, so I'll find somebody to replace me in my movie channel job. He goes, no, you can do both jobs. So now the salary I was working for was half of what people in actual television made. And now I was working two jobs at what we would now call a startup. It was really just getting started. It was run by two big corporations, but they gave us just a little bit of money to see what this cable TV thing was all about and whether we could make something of it. And so I ended up becoming what they now call a co-founder of what became MTV. I started bringing all my friends in that I had grown up with, like the guy who designed the logo. I literally have known since I'm 4 years old. And he was a brilliant artist even as a child, and he liked music even more than I did. So I was able to bring him in on that project to figure out, like, okay, how do we design this channel? And then I brought in a friend from college radio to work with me to, do all the little animations that we did of the M logo that happened. And down the hall was another channel that our company had started called Nickelodeon. It was at the time, it was kind of like PBS Kids is now, no commercials, all things that were good for kids, and no kids watched. There were 30 cable channels, and Nickelodeon was number 30. They had one show a week that people would watch that had a rating. It was a nutty comedy show called You Can't Do That on Television. And they were losing millions and millions of dollars a year. I mean, in what would now be tens of millions of dollars a year. So after a few years, MTV did really well. I did really well there. But I had grown up in a family that had its own business. My parents were pharmacists, and I worked in my mom and dad's store from the time I was 5 years old. And the idea of working for a living or working for a boss didn't really make too much sense to me. And after 3 years, I quit MTV to start my own shop with my friend from college radio. And pretty much the next day, our MTV boss called us up and hired us back as consultants, because it turned out that we had done things that they liked and that were important to them. And one of the first jobs they came and told us about is that Nickelodeon was going to be closed down unless they could figure out a way for it to become popular. And my partner and I went to work with them to help them out. We didn't really understand anything about kids programming. We were in our late 20s, early 30s at the time. We didn't even know if we liked kids. We didn't know that if we were going to have kids. We've now both since had children. And we didn't really like the people working in kids' TV. And it was all like, whatever, but we needed the work because we were a new company and we needed to make some money. And it turned out that the people who were working at Nickelodeon understood kids, but they didn't really understand television all that much. And we understood television, but they didn't really understand. We didn't understand kids too much. And so it was a really great match because these people who ran the channel, it's a woman named Jerry Laybourne and her head of programming named Debbie BC. And they taught us about kids and we taught them about television. And 6 months after we went to work with Nickelodeon, they became the #1 cable network. They went from last to first in 6 months because of the work that we helped them do. And for the next, 7, 8, 9 years, we worked steadily with MTV and Nickelodeon. We built our company, they built their companies. We did really well together. And we were kind of reminded of what it was like to be in kids, in kids television. And what cartoons were all about. The most popular things that were on Nickelodeon at the time tended to be animation. We helped them develop the Nicktoons project that came up with Ren and Stimpy and Rugrats and Doug, and we had a lot of good times doing it. But over the years, my partner and I kind of got sick of each other, and now instead of having a boss, we had a million bosses because we had clients, and we kind of got sick of that. And one day I was having a conversation with another friend of mine from cable television who ran Ted Turner's company. And he told me they were about to start Cartoon Network because they had just bought the Hanna-Barbera studios. And he knew I was like a little unhappy in my job at my own company. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come and run Hanna-Barbera?" And I was like, "Well, I've never made cartoons. The only animation I've worked with is these little 10-second, animations with the logos." He said, "Look, it couldn't get any worse. Hanna-Barbera hasn't had a hit in 10 years. If you don't have a hit, nobody will blame you. And if you do have a hit, people will think you're great." And so sure enough, I broke up with my partner. I was breaking up with my first wife. I was breaking up with New York. I was like, at that point, kind of sick of New York City. I moved to Los Angeles, walked into the studio for the first time as the boss, not knowing what I was doing. I knew nothing. I had no idea what went on in that building. And the rest is history. It kind of worked.
That was an amazing story. I didn't know like a bunch of those details, like doing research about you before the interview. Um,
Fantastic.
and I mean, I'm wearing the Adventure Time pin. I don't know if you can see it, but
Oh, I love that. That's great. Okay, yeah.
so Chance, moving on from the first point, as somebody who has been in this industry for as long as you have, and with your philosophy of creators first, always original, and producing your next favorite cartoon, can you tell if there's been an industry-wide emphasis on stories centered around people of color within the industry that is focused on quality and quantity? And if so, is it easier for people of color to find a seat at that table?
That's a complicated question, as is everything when it comes to inclusion. Historically, when I got into I got into the cartoon business 32 years ago. And it was a business that was incredibly white, incredibly male. There were a few Latinos. There were a few Asians. The women that worked in it tended to work in one corner of either in administration or in what they used to call the ink and paint department. And even though there were talented people of color, of various ethnicities, women, they didn't really have a voice in the industry. In fact, I had an intern, a female intern in animation, and that came right around the same time I went to the studio. She's now a critical writer director. I guess the most well-known thing she worked on was Phineas and Ferb. But that was 30 years ago. And there's still, there's more women now that are doing creation than ever before, which is fabulous. Some of the best cartoons that I've developed over the last 10 years have been with women creators. Still very few people of variety of white are there, right? There are a few Asians, a few Latinos, there are a couple of Black Americans, but not many, and not many in the business. So it's still the hill is still steep. I think it's a shame because I do think that it is an industry that needs different voices. And, ultimately, different voices is what makes pop culture popular because it brings in all different sort of strains of activity. Um, they're more they're more gay people, they're more trans people than before, but it's still, you know, person by person, not large groups of people. There was a quick moment after Black Lives Matter where there was an influx of various um, groups of people that came in, particularly over at Netflix. But the truth of the matter is, in animation, everything has slowed down. There are fewer people working than there were 3 or 4 years ago. There are fewer jobs. There are fewer productions going on. It's hard for everybody, including me. I haven't sold a brand new show in a few years, though they are rebooting some of my old shows, which is great. And the thing about diverse characters is it requires a creator who is sensitive to the variety of people in life. And the truth is, whether you are white or black, you're male, you're female, you're trans, you tend to be very focused on the people you know and the people you understand. And when you create characters around the people you know and understand. And that means that no matter who you are, if you are a trans creator, you're working very hard to bring in trans characters, and all of a sudden you're ignoring other kinds of characters that you can bring in. And none of that means anything other than changing how people tell stories and with what kind of characters is a slow process. In fact, if you were a creator today, you would be part of the change, but also part of the slowness because you would want to do what you want to do, not what other people want to do. And it isn't until we get to a place where the friend group you have has all the diversity, inclusion, all the equity that you would like it to have, that those characters will be that way. And I think that that's multiple generations down, not multiple years down, if that makes sense.
It does.
That said, we're seeing more than ever before, which is great. I think that's the easy way to put it.
It was so nice seeing like Marshall Lee have like locks in his hair and Fiona and Kate, and just
Right.
like deal with like the intersectionality of identity that comes with being both queer and black and navigating the
Absolutely.
world like with the uncomfortable relationship that he had with his parents in the show. And I would even say there's another facet of the intersectionality coming in with the interracial relationship too, and how that's also hard to navigate even in today's world. So I really thank you for displaying that in such a genuine way for so many people to attach to.
Yeah, it's a very hard, it's an interesting thing. I'm obviously much older than you are. I could be your grandfather by age, maybe your great grandfather. And I probably don't watch almost any of the shows that you watch. And in fact, a lot of my viewing, probably half of my viewing, are English mysteries and crime shows. Now, there's a really interesting thing that's going on in England, and I don't know anything about the English business. Like, I'm not in the business in the UK. But the thing that I've noticed in the last 5 years is almost every show that I watch has interracial couples, sometimes interracial gay couples, sometimes handicapped characters, characters without arms, you know, and guess what? It's never mentioned, right? There's never a mention of the fact that it's two gay women, one white, one black, who have a family. The differences are never mentioned. Yet when I ask my friends in England, is that the way your society really is? They just start laughing at me because no, it's not. But somewhere or other, someone has put an edict in that this is what we need to do in our shows. And let's not talk about it. Let's make it like it's a natural thing. So, what that means is that somewhere along the line, people are getting messages that aren't in your face, which is sometimes what we do here. Sometimes here in the shows that we do, when we've changed up what is the mix of characters, it's commented on within the characters, if you know what I mean. And you mentioned Castlevania, certainly the new Castlevania. It also is done in such a way that it's not mentioned, it just is, which I think is great. Though, interestingly, the head writer of the show happens to be from the UK. Now, I've never asked about this. I'm going to ask about it right after we hang up. I'm going to ask the showrunner, how did it come to be? Because he's very aware of it, because, you know, there's been a lot of negative social media related to the Black inclusion in the show. There's been a lot of positive, you know, about it, but there's also been, like only in America, a lot of not so positive. So I'm going to find out a little bit of where did I never even asked, like, where did it originate, like whose idea was it, and I'll check back with you and let you know.
I appreciate it. And that actually flows into another question perfectly. And I'm gonna jump around. But it actually
Sure.
flows perfectly. What fundamental distinctions between Western and Eastern animation have you noticed? Like you mentioned the UK, but even as far as like even anime and truly Eastern animations go, what fundamental distinctions have you noticed and have successfully or unsuccessfully integrated in your own storytelling? I know you touched on the UK influence on Castlevania, but what can you see Western animation learning and adapting from Eastern
Sure.
animation in this new era?
So, you know, one of the great things about my career is I almost never make a second show with someone. I'm always working with first time creators. And what that usually means is that creators are always another generation younger than the last ones that I worked with, right? Because it's first timers. And often first timers are just getting started, you know, early. It's not the first minute of their career, but it's early. And so what I have found is that each generation of creators looks at the world differently and brings to their shows, their characters, their writing, and their drawing that mix of things that individual creator understands. And I think that we've really seen that in the sweep. I've done whatever 20, 30 shows over the years. And all you have to do is look at the Fairly Odd Parent, the original Fairly Odd Parents, which is as white suburban as you can get in terms of setting and the characters that are there. And yesterday we announced the reboot of the Fairly Odd Parents, which is not in the suburbs. It's in the middle of Philadelphia, one of the most diverse cities, on the East Coast. And Timmy has grown up, and our lead character is a young Black girl living in the apartment next door to Cosmo and Wanda. So that comes from like a modern world of modern creators who are looking at the world differently. And the writer's room and the artist's room are made up of a much bigger mix of people, again, both gendered people and ethnic ethnicity or racial backgrounds. And you're seeing, that it has made a difference. It has definitely made a difference. Um, and I think that's going to happen all the time. It's going to keep happening. In terms of Western East, rather than focus on the show, here's one of the things that I have noticed, which is the difference of when I go. I've been going to Comic Cons on and off for 30 plus years. I've gone to record cons on and off for 30 plus years. And now I've gone to the anime meetups, over the last maybe 6, 7, 8 years. And I find in the anime meetups, the most diverse group of fans that are there, and not just now in gender, racial, ethnicity, but also in age, from very young to very old. In other words, it seems to me, anyway, from a distance, that the anime fan culture is the most diverse fan culture I've seen. And if that's the case, it means that the shows are going to be continually reflective of that fan culture, which I think is fabulous. It's so much, for me, it's so much nicer going to an anime meetup than to a Comic Con.
I will say, I think a lot of, I will, at least with Adventure Time and even with being Puppy Cat, I do see a lot of like generational um longevity between those shows. I know a lot of
Mm-hmm.
millennials that enjoy being Puppy Cat and Adventure Time, and I see a lot of Gen Z and inevitably Gen
Mm-hmm.
Alpha, as you know, Adventure Time is still continuing and it has this legacy to it, and being Puppy Cat has
Yep.
this this youthful, euphoric experience when you watch the show.
You bet.
It's calming.
The
It's
challenge, the challenge with being Puppy Cat is its audience is a lot smaller, right? The people who love it to death, and they love it deeply, but it's definitely a smaller group of people. And, Adventure Time's bigger. Fairly Odd Parents is even bigger, right? So the way these things influence is they influence like ripples in a pond, which is some of the things are at the middle and there's like a lot of ripples, and then some of the things are at the outer edge and there's a few ripples, but they all affect each other one way or the other.
referring back to Adventure Time and Fiona and Kate, it was recently greenlit for a second season. We've been talking a lot about diversity on the outskirts of what it feels like to be a human and that sort of identity. But in being Puppycat in the first season, you talked a lot about and deal with a lot about Simon's mental health and his feelings of inadequacy in a world where he dissociates from, he doesn't really recognize it. It's vastly different than the world he was conscious in hundreds of years ago. And I wanted to know if the topic of mental health was something you always wanted to cover in your work, or is it something that's become more of a priority as society has opened up conversations about mental health a lot more? Um, I just wanted to see what you wanted to say about that.
Well, the first thing to know is, how do I say this in the right way that it doesn't sound stupid? I don't want to do anything in particular or not want to do anything in particular. That's not what I look at my job as. My job is to recognize talented creators who have two things going for them. One is they have the talent and the skill to create great characters and great stories. And two, that they want to do them in a popular way. In other words, in the filmmaking business, there are little films where only a few people watch them. There are giant blockbusters where everyone watch them. And I'm more interested in the commercially successful part of them than what I'll loosely call the messaging part of them, right? And one of the reasons that I like the shows and the creators that I work with so much is that they figured out a way often to tell very personal stories and at the same time do them in a way that the audience, that a large audience likes them. You know, and the creators themselves are have wildly different backgrounds. You know, Butch Hartman comes from Michigan in the Midwest and is a born again Christian who is really dedicated to making people's lives better. You know, in addition to making his cartoons, he and his wife started a foundation where they help people in need build houses. They're incredibly hardworking, not just at the filmmaking that they do, but also outside of filmmaking, which, by the way, makes their filmmaking better and more interesting. The people who are currently working on Adventure Time Fiona and Cake, they're part of the world that we all live in, and they notice, you know, what is happening in the world, and they make these decisions as to what issues they want to address, how they want to address them, and how to address it in such a way that they make popular arts rather than what I'll loosely call obscure arts. Again, nothing wrong with either obscure or popular, but their goal is to take these issues that don't necessarily naturally become part of popular art and figure out a way to make it work that way. So you can love those characters, love those stories, and yet at the same time see those, I guess you'd call them messages, you know, in their work.
I think that's beautiful. I think it also goes back to, you know, your philosophy when making these cartoons of, you know, creators first, and this idea of this great idea of innovation and always looking for ways to make the best story possible while also making it, you know, easily accessible for a lot of different demographics.
Yeah, I think I told you the thing that changed my life was falling in love with the Beatles. And here was the thing that the Beatles brought to me, but they also brought to the world, which is up until then, popular music was just that, popular music. And it was sometimes serious, but it was sometimes light. You know, there was probably 10 years before the Beatles, one of the biggest hits was called How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? You know, it wasn't exactly like, you know, life-shattering material. What the Beatles realized and brought to the table, and certainly influenced me, is that you could be top of the pops and make great art at the same time. And that's been, you know, there are people who make many more popular cartoons than I do and do it much easier than I do. But my goal is always to make personal things also very popular. And I think that it's hard to do, but it's possible to do.
My last question for you for the night um, revolves around like the female protagonists that have always been associated with your work, such as, you know, the Powerpuff Girls being Puppy Cat, Fiona, and Kate. And I was wondering if you think that it is easier to get some of these shows greenlit as a white man in the industry than it is for women. I know you touched on that a little bit in the beginning, talking about how the
Well, first of
demographics
all,
have
I will.
always.
So yes, so I will tell you. First of all, it's not easy for me to get anything greenlit. It is not easy for anyone to get anything greenlit because. So remember, I've been in the business 30 years. I've made 20 series more or less. That's less than one a year, and that's a lot, right? That's a lot. But at the same time, remember, we're not making my shows. I'm helping creators make their shows, and most of them have only made one show and maybe sometimes two. That's how hard it is. When people are looking at me to bring them a show, I'm more like the insurance company than the show itself, if you know what I mean. People are sometimes comfortable with me because I've made other shows and I've made them on time and on budget, and they've been popular. And remember that when somebody is buying a show, essentially what they're doing is handing you a check for millions of dollars, and they don't want you to run away with it. And I'm known, people know that I won't run away with their money, that I'll make the best show that we can make. With a new creator, somebody, when Penn Ward came to us with Adventure Time, he was 1 month out of college. I didn't even know if I could trust him. And I don't mean trust him personally. I mean, he's a very trustworthy guy. But I had no idea what he could or couldn't do related to a show. And in fact, I have said in other interviews how I turned the show down for a lot of stupid reasons, all my stupidity. But one of the pieces of the puzzle was, did he know how to manage millions and millions of dollars and dozens of people? And honestly, the first couple of years were, a little bit of a roller coaster, because all of the little films that he had made in college, he made by himself and maybe with a friend or two. And now all of a sudden he's managing 20, 30, 40 people. Plus he has to deal with a corporation that is expected him to not only spend their money properly, but make them a lot more money. And my role in that was to help them feel good about that person, not just about his show, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I do think it's very hard for people to get their shows greenlit. And I think it's harder for anyone who hasn't made a show before to get their show made. And if they do get it made, it's harder for them to hold on to their vision of the show when there are a lot of competing interests that are pounding on them on any given moment to do it. So it's hard. It is hard, and it's harder for people who aren't seen as people who are part of the sweep of the industry. So if you're not a white male, everything is harder, just the way it is in life. If you're not a white, I was about to say white straight male, I'm trying to think. That's a little less true. There are more gay creative people, lead creative people than, but let's leave it at that. If you're not a white straight male, everything's harder. But so's getting a taxi is harder too, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
on every level, life is harder. And there's very little that can be done about that than what we are all doing every single day to try and make things easier.
I know we're running out of time, but I did want to ask one final question that kind of ties everything together. Are you worried about the future of animation? Because like you just said, like it's harder to get these shows greenlit, and it's hard to, with all these different mergers and companies kind of clashing and
Yeah.
merging together.
Yeah, it sucks. Yeah, it's terrible. But I will tell you, I'm worried about the future of entertainment in general, because everything is harder right now. We are in an ultra chaotic time at the moment. We are in the midst of a business revolution on the television side and on the movie side. And that affects literally everything and everybody. And it affects animation a little bit more, because if all you have to do is look at how many shows are on television, however you want to count, how many of them are animated, And forever and a day, animation is a very small percentage of overall what is made. And that means that animation is the first thing to get ignored and not paid attention to, which makes it even harder. Now, all that being said, I'm a complete optimist. I know things will get better. When things are bad, things will always get better. The only question is, how long will it take to get better? And what will it take to make it better? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer to either of those questions. I'm a complete optimist because of when wonderful creative people show up, it changes everything. Creative people are the people who can see the future and change it. And not every creative person can change it in the way they want. Not every creative person can change it for the better, but it's only creative people who can really make a difference. And I'm always optimistic about creative people, no matter who they are, what group they represent.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time tonight to have this conversation with me.
I always will. So why don't you tell me really quickly, whether you want to put it on your video or not, tell me about you, what you do, and what you're hoping to do when you're done with school.
Of course. So right now I'm in my sophomore year of um being going towards the path of being an English major. English is something I've always been passionate about. If you could see
Fantastic.
the wall of books behind me, it would probably amaze you. Um,
I want to interrupt you quickly. Whenever an artist asks me how they can do better at filmmaking, I tell them they should read more and write more, which always makes an artist uncomfortable because there's a reason they don't read and write too much. But that's the best thing that you can do. Well, it's the best thing you can do for your life, having nothing to do with what you want to do for your living, right?
yes,
So
sir.
I interrupted you. You're an English major, sophomore. Okay.
And right now I have some books right with me here, but I've taken the time out of my normal curriculum that I'm studying, and I'm putting an emphasis not just during Black History Month, but studying race. And I want to
All
learn
right.
how to it started actually by watching Spider-Verse. So it all kind of ties back to animation perfectly. I was watching Spider-Verse
Aren't those the greatest movies?
ever, and I have the
I'm
art book
so
right behind me.
I'm so jealous of those movies. They're so great.
But I was watching the movies and I had to pause it because I was watching it with somebody who had never seen them before. And he was like, "Why'd you pause it?" And I just had to ask myself, why did there was a contrast in Miles between both movies of when we are introduced to him and into the Spider-Verse, he's this young Black man really attached to his environment, and he doesn't, the way you're an optimist, the way he couldn't perceive better for himself. He was okay being complacent in that environment. He was arguing with his dad in the car. I'm not sure this private school is what's meant for me. I'm cool with just being who I am now. He never envisioned himself being better. And when we are
Mhm.
reintroduced to him and across the Spider-Verse, it's wanting the upper pinnacles and wanting, like, aspiring for better that ends up hurting him in the end. And seeing that contrast and asking those questions of what is this box that Miles finds himself placed in? In the first movie, he doesn't know there's a box around him. He's just okay within it. But as he becomes Spider-Man, as he's forced to mature, as he's forced to become better, that box becomes something that he's escaped from and society wants to put him back in. And I think a lot of that comes from fear, confusion. There's this, the way somebody so young could be so powerful with their voice, with their actions, with their drive, their motivation. And it just led me towards a path of how can I make this world, how can I make everybody feel like that? To go through strife, to still come out on top like he did in Across the Spider-Verse. And we haven't seen him truly accept this reality that he's forced to face, but just to know that everybody truly does have the power, not only to wear the mask, but to handle the storms and the burdens that come with that. How can I make this world better to where people can juggle all the storms that come with being excellent. And that's my goal as an English major is to keep reading, to keep writing, to keep researching, and to keep convincing people that it's always possible. It's always possible to be the one to stand up. It's not always going to be easy. We
Totally.
will all make mistakes. I make mistakes trying to educate people to do better because I see the way my life has shaped me. I see the world very differently than others, and I want to use that ability to correct the world.
You
And
bet.
to have the ability to be corrected myself and educated myself. We all can educate each other. And I think there's such a beauty that comes with that.
So you know what that spider costume is?
I think of
That's
it as a
his
symbol.
it's his education. It's how he has learned. And what you're doing by reading is by educating yourself, you're learning about the world that goes past the world that you already know. So that's a great thing that you're doing for yourself and for the people who are going to be around you in your life. Good for you.
I appreciate it, sir.
It's
I
really true.
actually
You're taking care of it yourself.
a few years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Dan Milano over at Nickelodeon, and he ended up sending me a script of Glitch Checks, which was his show. So I always love talking to people in animation and publishing and seeing the interconnectivity between both mediums, seeing how they both just tell stories that everybody needs. I feel like animation and publishing are the most diverse industries that we have right now for young
Sure.
children to see themselves in, but also for adults to heal that inner child within them, to see themselves represented in ways that maybe they wish they had been represented. And the one thing that I even hear with the authors that I do follow is that they write for that inner child. They write because these stories were not available to them when they were younger, when they needed these stories, and they write these stories and put out these stories for people who do need them now.
Right. I think that's really true. Well, good for you. It's been a great time meeting you. I'm glad maybe some of the stuff I said can be helpful, and I hope you stay in touch with me.
I will. You have a wonderful evening.
Okay. You too. Take care of yourself.
You
Okay. Bye
too.
bye now.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.